Jesus wants to eclipse the stars. He wants to replace the elements. He established a cult that grew into a religion after he died. First, start with the Israelites and convince them to worship me. Threat isn't neutralized until we eradicate all traces of what God really is.
But when it comes to the gospel, there's a difference between the reservation native and the urban native.
Wake up out of your sleep.
The colonization of the American Indian didn't begin with Christopher Columbus. The colonization of the American Indian didn't begin with Hernando de Soto. The colonization of the American Indian didn't even begin in America. It began in ancient Greece with a community of European writers, the creators of the New Testament. The American Indians revered the elements as sacred, and they only worshipped existence itself. Existence is the universe, and she's made up of elements. The New Testament is the final quarter of the Bible, the last 25%. The final fourth of the Bible is an elaborate attempt to anthropomorphize the elements as a single human being. Its entire purpose is to convince readers that power is only accessible through that man. Christianity consolidates and truncates the elements by calling them God, and it refers to existence as a person by calling it the Lord. The New Testament primarily reserves this term for Jesus. Jesus is Lord, right? That's what the Europeans wrote, the New Testament. What no one notices, though, is that the Old Testament, which makes up 75% of the Bible, depicts God very differently. It was written by the actual Hebrews, and it depicts what you call God as the elements, which is exactly what the American Indians considered holy. It furthermore depicts existence as the only entity worthy of worship, which is also consistent with many American Indian traditions. The Old Testament provides an indigenous perspective, whereas the New Testament colonizes that perspective by overriding every sacred part of it to deify humanity itself. The idea of man being God is little more than a Eurocentric fixation. I'm going to demonstrate all this, but to do so, I must first introduce you to the Shamanic Hichiti principle of discernment. Hum Kane Ace Ho Sifi Coat Oats, Ho Ko Lane Ace Ho Lotta Kate Oats, 210 Ace Ho Dull Leech 8 Oats. What does it mean? 1 is an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. 1 is an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. 1 is an incident, 2's a coincidence, 3 is a pattern. This is the first shamanic principle of the awakening, and it comes from the Hichiti people, the Creek nation of the Etowah Mound. These are my direct lineal ancestors. Now, Jesus was a real person who incited the Jewish-Roman wars and provided the ideological impetus for why Rome should expend money and human resources to subjugate the chiefdom. He was not, however, the elements, nor was he the son of the elements. First, we need to prove that Jesus isn't who you think he is. Then we can identify who he really was and explore what he actually did. Let's start with Matthew chapter 16, verses 27 and 28. This is Jesus speaking candidly with his disciples. He tells them, quote, "For the Son of Man shall come in the glory of his Father with his angels." With his what? With his angels, right? "And then he shall reward every man according to his works." Okay, meaning he's going to give each human being what they deserve for their ratio of good deeds to bad deeds. In other words, he'll send you to heaven or hell, right? That's judgment. "Verily, I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste of death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." End quote. Yeah, So that last line, Jesus says that there are some people standing right there in front of him, meaning some of the disciples, who will still be alive by the time Jesus comes back in his kingdom. In other words, Jesus is prophesying that his second coming will occur within the lifetimes of some of the disciples. We know he's talking about the second coming because it's when he rewards or punishes all humanity for their deeds. It's the end of the world, basically. That's when Jesus comes. Even the angels come with him for this event. That's definitely the second coming, which scholars call the Advent. Jesus says this will happen while some of the disciples are still alive. Some people like to argue that this is because everyone will be resurrected when Jesus comes. But Jesus clearly says these disciples will not only be alive, but won't have even tasted of death. Not tasting of death means they weren't even briefly dead. They won't need to be resurrected because they will never have died in the first place. Ergo, Jesus will return in their lifetime. If these words are true, why do Christians still wait for Jesus to return some 2,000 years later? The fact that Jesus said this constitutes an incident. It's an incident that contradicts the entire doctrine of Christianity, but we're going to sally forth to Matthew chapter 24. This chapter opens with the disciples admiring the architecture of the temple in verse 1. But in verse 2, Jesus prophesies that the temple will be destroyed so thoroughly that not one stone will be left standing upon another. In the third verse, the disciples ask when this will happen. Jesus monologues for the next 26 verses explaining all the calamitous things that will happen to serve as signs that the time we're talking about is near, and the time we're talking about is the time when the temple will be destroyed. This time period is called the time of trouble, and Christians assume it's either the modern era or coming very soon in the future because of what's said in verses 29 through 34. Quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days, meaning right after the time of trouble, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass, till all these things be fulfilled. End quote. Okay, you catch that? The last line explicitly tells the disciples that their own generation will not pass away before all the things he's been talking about for the past 26 verses finally happen. Everything he's been saying in this chapter was prophesied to happen before that generation could die off, including the second coming of Jesus himself. Right? Because he said they would see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with angels, which matches how he described the same event in Matthew 16. We know for sure what he's talking about, right? When he talks about the fig tree's branch getting tender and leaves budding from it, he says that's a sign that it's almost summertime. Then he says, in that same way, when you see all the things he's been talking about in this chapter, you'll know that it's almost time for the Advent, the second coming of Jesus Christ. Do you see this? He's emphasizing to the disciples how soon it will be. Why is he saying how soon his second coming will be if he knows he won't be back for 2,000 plus years? It won't even be their problem anymore by then. They don't even need to watch for these signs because these signs aren't going to manifest until Donald Trump's president, right? Wrong. He told them to watch for these signs because they're supposed to be alive to observe them. And the main topic that sparked this conversation is actually one of the signs, the destruction of the temple. As it so happens, all these things did happen, including the destruction of the temple, which occurred in the year 70 when the Roman army sacked Jerusalem. The gospel narrative is set in the 1st century, so that's when Jesus and the disciples had to have lived. It all lines up perfectly within the 1st century. It all happened just like he said it would, with one massive exception. Jesus never came with his angels, and all those people are dead now. This actually explains what he meant in Matthew 16. The reason why Jesus said some of the disciples wouldn't even taste of death before the second coming is because their whole generation would still be walking the earth when it happened. It's not just the disciples who would still be here, but rather many people from their generation. It all makes sense. But we've only demonstrated a coincidence at this point. We have two incidents that contradict the cornerstone of Christian doctrine. So now we're going to jump backward to Matthew 10 to look at one of the first things Jesus ever explained to the disciples when they first began following him. He was telling them from verse 5 onward to go evangelize the Israelites, meaning convince all Israelites to come worship him. Evangelize basically means advertise the idea of Jesus saving you from something. But Jesus was also warning them that many Israelites would be offended by what they were preaching and that this work might get dangerous. That's when we get to verse 23, wherein he says, quote, "When they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." End quote. So Jesus is saying, just run away to another town anytime you get accosted for what you're preaching, because my second coming will happen before you can even reach all the towns of Judea. This makes it sound super quick, honestly, because it suggests the disciples won't even have enough time to preach the gospel to all of Judea before the Advent occurs. It's now 2025, and Christians have actually spread the gospel to every landmass, every nation, every state, every town on earth. The disciples are dead. And the disciples of the disciples have covered far more than just the towns of Judea. Nevertheless, Jesus still isn't back. He was supposed to return for the same generation into which he was born. And some of the original 12 disciples were supposed to still be alive when he returned. That would have all explained how the second coming could happen before they could preach to all the towns of Judea. We've just demonstrated a pattern of Jesus prophesying that he would come with angels sometime during the 1st or early 2nd century CE to pass righteous judgment on all humanity. That prophecy never came true, so the true Yaśarelim are supposed to recognize a failed prophecy and immediately remember the words of Devarim, which is now collated as the book of Deuteronomy in the Bible. In chapter 18, verses 20 through 22, Existence told her chosen people, quote, "The prophet which shall presume to speak a word in my name which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even that prophet shall die." End quote. Those prophets did die. One of them was Jesus. He invoked the name of Existence and prophesied that Existence would send Jesus back with angels after death, resurrection, and life in heaven, while seated at the right hand of Existence on the throne. Existence never intended any such thing. Reading the last two verses, Existence continues, quote, "And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which Yahweh hath not spoken? When a prophet speaketh in the name of Yahweh, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which Yahweh hath not spoken, but the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him." End quote. We are not to respect, revere, or adhere to the words of a prophet whose prophecies have failed, because that prophet is proven to not be speaking for Yahweh. Jesus was and still is worshipped as God, but he was just a man. God even allegedly impregnated Mary to create Jesus via immaculate conception, right? Trinitarianism goes as far as to say that God is made up of three selves, which are God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. This entire concept is found nowhere in the Hebrew Scrolls. It's not even in the Europeans' New Testament either. It's a fabrication that Jesus and his original cult created to deliberately mask and erase Elohim. The question is, if Elohim isn't Jesus and his father and their ghost, then what is it? Elohim is plural, so it's not actually one thing. Elohim is the elements. We're talking earth, wind, water, fire, plasma, but also carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, helium. The elements are alive and they're conscious. They think independently, and they designed not only our entire world, but every world in the universe. Let's go back to the very beginning. Remember, Genesis 1 verse 26 famously features God saying, quote, "Let us make man in our own image." Christians use this to justify Trinitarianism, but we just proved Jesus is nothing, which means the Trinity idea can't be used to explain this verse. So this can't be God the Father having a conversation with God the Son and the Holy Ghost. So who's talking to whom? It's the elements themselves talking to one another. Back up to the first two verses. Quote, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." End quote. Okay, first, look at the word God there in Hebrew. That's a Germanic translation of Elohim, and the singular form is Eloha, which comes from two Semitic morphemes, El and Hai. El literally means power, and Hai literally means living. So putting them together, Eloha means living power. That's why some passages like Joshua 3 verse 10 separate out the word Eloha as High El by saying things like, "Ye shall know that the living God is among you." It's living power, literally the life force. The reason it's almost always plural and rarely ever singular, though, is because there's no single power of life. There are many powers of life cooperating to sustain everything, and they originally cooperated to create everything too. Your consciousness is just arcs of electricity jumping all over your brain. Your physical composition is never less than 50% water. There's a heat source burning within you to keep your body just under 100 degrees Fahrenheit. All the body's core functions use minerals from the earth like copper, iron, and zinc. The elements are literally cooperative life forces. So, back to the beginning of Genesis 1, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. King James Version is Middle English, and in Middle English, face often means surface, as in surface. How's there already waters if nothing's been created yet? It's because this isn't the beginning of the earth, much less the beginning of the universe. It's only the beginning of life on earth. The only reason Christians don't get this is because they have to separate ancient Hebrew shamanism from science in order to insert Jesus. Let's go to the Encyclopedia of Astrobiology and look up the definition of the term primordial soup. Quote, "The primordial soup is a generic term that describes the aqueous solution of organic compounds that accumulated in primitive water bodies of the early Earth as a result of endogenous abiotic syntheses and the extraterrestrial delivery by cometary and meteoritic collisions, and from which some have assumed that the first living systems evolved." End quote. So to put it simply, evolutionary biologists feel they have enough data to guess that a body of water containing early organic compounds somehow facilitated the extraterrestrial interference, which you could also call divine intervention, for the synthesis of several things, including ribonucleic acid or RNA. That's how the first living things came about. This is actually the most popular mainstream conjecture on how living organisms came to exist on Earth. The first water is the pool from whence life came when something extraterrestrial synthesized RNA in that pool. This is what the Hebrews are talking about in Genesis 1. The Spirit of God moved on the surface of the first waters. A 2024 study conducted by many of the most celebrated physicists in the world found that there's an entire society of plasma beings living in Earth's atmosphere, and that they appear to be capable of synthesizing RNA on their own. Plus, they're theorized to be residual energies from the Big Bang, and they're sentient, conscious, social creatures of pure light. I'll link my Plasma Orbs video at the end of this presentation so you can check out my breakdown on that. The plasma beings are descendants of Elohim, translated as sons of God in English. They were the agents of creation.
Hey y'all! First of all, like and subscribe to the channel, but also, Unahia is recruiting, and if you don't know what Unahia is, we're a grassroots activist group lobbying Congress to amend a bill to require education and research to acknowledge the Negro origins of Aboriginal groups of North America. If any of you have it to give, please support the campaign using the QR code on your screen, join the campaign with a donation, and if you have the time, you can even join our staff to help guide the organization, not just for this campaign, but also future endeavors. Don't speak about it, be about it. Let's go.
Now the Cherokee call the Great Spirit Na-Diné. It has no human form, by the way, so it has never manifested as Jesus. The etymology of the word stems from Uneha and Gotlu-Naki. Uneha means he has liquid, and Gotlu-Naki means created. Put together, they mean he who possesses the liquid created. In other words, the owner of the first water is the creator of living things. That's what the name means, and that's about abiotic synthesis in the primordial soup of early Earth. Makes sense. So, U-Nate-Law-Nuk-He is the water in which life was created. So how did the Cherokee and the ancient Hebrews have traditions that explain the heterotrophic theory of the origin of life if the primordial soup wasn't even theorized until 1924 when it was finally introduced by Alexander Oparin? This is uncanny insight for any ancient ethnic group to have without the aid of the periodic table, electron microscopes, or any of the many other advancements of modern science. It's because Cherokee are Yaśarelim, and Yaśarelim were given this information by the elements themselves. What even is the spirit of Elohim? And why was it doing something on the surface of the primordial soup? Look at Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. Quote, "And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life, from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die." End quote. Look at that word breath in Hebrew. That's ruah. It means spirit, breath, and wind. One word for all three, because all three are the same thing. Wind is another of the elements. What do the Creek Indians call the Great Spirit? Hesogkata-me-si. It literally means master of breath or lord of the sacred wind. The winds of the earth control all storm systems, water cycles for all ecosystems, and as January of 2025 proved to everyone, the ignition and sustenance of wildfires. They control the operations of the earth, and they are the source of the cycle of breath within you. Not just anyone inhale or exhale, but rather the constant cycle of in and out. That's your personal share of the sacred wind, which sustains you from day to day until you have to give it back. And that's also what moved upon the surface of the prebiotic pool carrying the plasma orbs I mentioned, which both Cherokee and Creek call thunderers. The Navajo and Apache call them sky people. Do you get it yet? This is what God actually is, a collection of conscious elements who can communicate with human beings at will. They primarily choose to communicate with a specific ancient ethnic group whom the universe chose to be humanity's liaison with the elements. That's who the Yaśarelim are. Jesus has no part in this, yet his narrative depicts him as having authority over the elements themselves. If you're raised Christian, you won't see the disrespect in this. That's why they depict the unverifiable event wherein Jesus and the disciples are on a boat out at sea when a violent storm comes just for Jesus to command the winds to cease and command the waters to be still. It's why Jesus is seen walking on water. It's why he sends the Holy Spirit to his apostles after he ascends to heaven, which manifests as embers on their heads. What does the first passage of the Gospel of John say? Quote, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made." Skip down to verse 14. "And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us." End quote. So Jesus was the Word of God himself, yet he spoke a word in the name of God multiple times, and that word proved false when it didn't materialize in reality. Nonetheless, Jesus is somehow the one through whom all things were created, not the elements. All living things still carry traces of those elements in them, yet it wasn't the elements that made them. It was Jesus who will soon return before the deceased, ancient generation of his providence can pass away. Yeah, no, God is earth, wind, fire, water, lightning, carbon dioxide, ultraviolet, copper, melanin. That's how Elohim is omnipresent. They're not an invisible concept whose existence is in question. They're what holds our entire world together right in front of our eyes every day. We directly interact with the gods on a regular basis, and they have a mind of their own. Who even was Jesus that the writers of John's Gospel would even claim he was the elements all by himself? Well, remember back in Matthew 10 when Jesus told the disciples to just leave any city where they were persecuted for proselytizing because he would soon return before they could evangelize in each town anyway. If you look at the beginning of all the admonitions he gave the disciples in that conversation, he prefaced it all in verses 5 and 6 by saying, quote, "Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." End quote. Jesus gave explicit instructions. He said, don't go preach to anyone who's not an Israelite yet. First, start with the Israelites and convince them to worship me. A Gentile is anyone who's not an Israelite. A Samaritan is just one of many examples of Gentiles, and it was the Gentile ethnic group they were most likely to encounter first in Judea. The most important target for evangelism was the Israelites, but only a fraction of Israelites even still lived in Judea during the day of Christ. Most had already scattered to other regions of the world over the course of the last 5 centuries or so. This is where Arsareth comes into play. Arsareth is the Hebrew name for a region of East Asia. Some believe Arsareth is America itself. It's impossible to prove for sure what the writers meant when using this term, but it only appears once. It was written in the 13th chapter of what the King James Apocrypha calls 2nd Esdras. The Latin Vulgate calls it 4th Esdras. But either way, it's allegedly a continuation of Sefer Etzra, which we now call the books of Ezra and Nehemiah in the King James Bible. 2nd Esdras, the one that mentions Arsareth, was a European Christian book. It's not written by our people. Let me explain how we can know this. Now remember when Jesus foretold the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? That genuinely did happen in 70 CE, but afterward Jesus was supposed to return with angels, and he didn't. So the fact that part of the prophecy came true, but not the most important part, means the prophecy didn't carry any divine power. And without divine power, it must not have been a prophecy at all. The words of Jesus about the destruction of the temple were likely written after the temple was already destroyed. And the early cult of Christ deceptively told people it was something said decades prior. Many scholars like Dennis Dooling or John Riches and David Sim cite certain parts of the Gospel of Matthew as things that indicate the author was writing right after the Jewish revolt that ended 3 years after the destruction of the temple. Quote, "This empire context is important for Matthew, which was written in the post-war years." End quote. That's page 304 of a book called The Blackwell Companion to the New Testament. Again, we're not just taking his word for it. We already proved that the prophecy of the temple's destruction must not have been a real prophecy if it included the second coming of Jesus, which didn't happen. That's one of many reasons why it was likely written retrospectively. We have demonstrated a pattern that disproves power in Jesus' words, so we have to give more weight to mortal explanations for the passages we're reading in Matthew. The most logical of which is that someone lied to everyone to backdate a text that they didn't even start writing until the wars and rumors of wars were over, including the destruction of the temple. Well, 2nd Esdras attempts to make the same deception Matthew makes, and it fails the same way. The first 2 chapters actually describe the rejection of Jews and the embrace of the Christian movement, and Christianity wasn't even noticeably favored until the 2nd century CE, at the earliest. It's supposed to be written by Ezra, who lived several centuries earlier. Ezra was the shaman who led our ancestors of the tribes of Judah, Levi, and Benjamin back to the Promised Land from Babylon. And he demanded that all Yaśarelim leave their non-Yaśareli spouses behind. No interracial marriages were allowed to return because of Ezra. Ezra 9, verses 1 and 2, quote, "Now when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites, for they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been chief in this trespass." End quote. Trespass means sin. Ezra is declaring very matter-of-factly that it was a sin for our ancestors to marry all those foreign peoples, and that much of the judgment against us came because of that intermarriage. Yaśarelim is supposed to be a separate ethnic group from all other ethnicities on the planet. Everyone else can mix with each other, but we must remain separate so that the identity of the people whom nature has chosen as its priesthood doesn't change or disappear. The same Ezra who explained all this would not also write the first chapter of 2nd Esdras. Because 2nd Esdras ends with the Great Spirit essentially vowing to replace the Yaśarelim with nations who never knew her. 2nd Esdras, chapter 1, verses 35 to 40, quote, "Your houses will I give to a people that shall come, which, not having heard of me yet, shall believe me, to whom I have showed no signs, yet they shall do that I have commanded them. They have seen no prophets, yet they shall call their sins to remembrance, and acknowledge them. I take to witness the grace of the people to come, whose little ones rejoice in gladness. And though they have not seen me with bodily eyes, yet in spirit they believe the thing that I say." So Helper, or Ezra, supposedly says that the greater existence will abandon Yaśarelim and give our home and the teachings of our prophets to a random people from the east. Helper would never write this in his day, because his focus was on ensuring that Yaśarelim returned to Torah to earn their anointing again forever. That's why Helper condemned the men of Yaśarelim for taking foreign wives. It's why he demanded that they leave those families behind to start new ones in the Promised Land with Yaśarelim women. How would he completely reverse his perspective in the same lifetime? Also, the universe would never have told Helper this because it directly contradicts what she told Nature Rising, whom you call Jeremiah or Yirmiyah. Jeremiah 31, verse 35 and 36, quote, "Thus saith existence, which giveth the sun for a light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The armies of existence is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith existence, then the seed of Yaśarelim also shall cease from being a nation before me forever." End quote. So Nature Rising reported that the universe had already vowed that the Yaśarelim will remain the chosen people until the laws of physics stop working, when the moon and stars no longer cause tidal waves or light the night. It's a hyperbolic way of saying Yaśarelim will never be replaced. Now we can finally understand the significance of 2nd Esdras, chapter 13, where Arsareth is mentioned. Our people constantly use this passage to prove that the American Indians are the Yaśarelim. Here's the thing. Arsareth is a vague Hebrew name for a non-specific region to the Far East from the perspective of the Greco-Roman realm, and the author can't be trusted because they've already shown their hand. The book is already serving the Christian agenda, and we now know Jesus was a false prophet. This book is a false book written by the followers of Jesus to colonize the Yaśarelim. However, the fact that it mentions Arsareth at all still has cultural significance. It means that the author had reason to believe the readers in his day would know what he was talking about to some extent. Arsareth meant something to them. I'll break down what Arsareth is in a future video, but what's the point of the passage in Esdras 13? Starting in verse 40, quote, "Those are the 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Osea the king, whom Salmanasar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters. And so came they into another land. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth into a further country, where never mankind dwelt." Skipping down to verse 45, "For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Arsareth." End quote. Again, I don't have time to break down what Arsareth really is right now, but Suffice it to say, it's a Hebrew proper noun referring to a non-specific land of the Far East. The purpose in writing this in the 2nd century CE was clearly to explain to readers where all the missing Yaśarelim went. This passage demonstrates that Mediterranean peoples already suspected that the Yaśarelim had ventured far east. That's the Na-Diné migration from East Asia to America. This exposition on Arsareth proves early Christians knew that the northern Yaśarelim had become part of the Mongol society and even passed through it. This was apparently something the author of Esdras felt his audience would easily comprehend, knowing which direction he's talking about and easily believing the lost tribes had gone there. The readers would have been Christians because, as we've already established, this was written in the Christian community, with a messianic focus on other people, replacing the Yaśarelim. Remember? That's a Christian concept. This is an extension of Jesus' influence, hunting down the 10 tribes that had been long gone already by the time Rome destroyed Zerubbabel's temple in Jerusalem. This is an attempt to point out which way our ancestors went so that Christians could figure out where to look for us. This influence directly led to the colonization of the Americas. Christopher Columbus came here expecting to find the Yaśarelim for this reason because he read this book. The Jewish encyclopedia includes that information too. Quote, "The name of the land beyond the great river, far away from the habitation of man, in which the 10 tribes of Israel will dwell, observing the laws of Moses, until the time of the restoration according to 4th Esdras 13:45. Columbus identified America with this land." End quote. This was the real purpose of his voyages. We were the real gold. Christopher Columbus was sent with this in mind because this was a common consideration. He even brought a Hebrew interpreter with him. Luis de Torres was a crypto-Jewish companion on Columbus's voyage. Look at this article from the foreword. It says, quote, "As described in Maria Rosa Monacal's 2002 book, The Ornament of the World, Torres left with Columbus's first voyage on August 3, 1492, a day after the Spanish Edict of Expulsion ordered the forced exodus of the country's Jews. He was born Yosef ben Ha-Levi Hivri before being christened with his new name shortly prior to leaving." Skip down to the next paragraph. Leaving his native land from the port of Palos, Torres was probably not the only Jew on board, though he had the highest profile. Torres, who according to Arsareth's article on Conversos in the New World served as an interpreter for the governor of Murcia, was charged with being Columbus's translator in India, which is what we now know as China, and which of course was actually the Americas. End quote. They're citing an article from Haaretz, which is one of the biggest Israeli magazines there is. This is a mainstream fact. Christopher Columbus brought a crypto-Jew to the Americas as an interpreter, which is only helpful if you expect to find Hebrew speakers here. Today, academics call this Jewish Indian theory, and it has its own Wikipedia page because of how prolific it was in the Age of Discovery. The earliest literature to fully explore the theory systematically came in 1607. It was called The Origin of the Indians of the New World. It was written by Gregorio Garcia, and it contributed to an ongoing conversation in Europe about Indians whom they called Negroes being the children of Yaśarelim. Garcia's argument was that Aztec and Mayan society was Hebrew, based on looking like Sephardic Jews, having Hebrew rituals, including idolatry, and a language that used glottals like the lost tribes of Israel traveled to the Americas alongside other migrations, including of Carthaginians and Phoenicians and people from China, Tartary, and Atlantis. He even said Mex in Mexico was based on the Hebrew term Mashiach for Messiah, because the Nawa didn't say Mex. They said Meishi, which is like the Arabic variant, Macy. Why do you think William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, was so convinced that Lin-Na-Pei were Yaśarelim? Why does Jewish Indian theory even exist? They were chasing what they considered to be Oriental Jews, meaning Yaśarelim, who long ago migrated through China and surrounding lands only to disappear for centuries until being rediscovered by European colonizers crossing the Atlantic. Why the hell was it so important to Christianize the Indians? Because Jesus prioritized the Yaśarelim as a target for evangelism. Go get them and Christianize them. We already got everybody else, but the threat isn't neutralized until we eradicate all traces of what God really is. You have to go chase down the people who still possess that knowledge and force them to abandon it. Jesus wants to eclipse the stars. He wants to replace the elements. He established a cult that grew into a religion after he died. And the most important part of that religion is to spread the gospel, because the church teaches that Jesus allegedly won't return until the gospel has been preached to the entire world. Jesus is a false prophet and an agent of imperialism. His ideology was picked up by Rome, who went out in search of you. They replaced their own gods with Jesus too, and they'll be goddamned if you don't do the same. Jesus provided Europeans with a handbook on how to replace the Yaśarelim. Romans 11:11, quote, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. But rather, through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. End quote. That's Paul speaking. Paul wrote more books of the New Testament than anyone else. He identified as one of us, but he considered himself a messenger sent special by Jesus to explain the gospel to the colonizer. The message was that if our fall be the riches of the world, then the diminishing of us will be the riches of the Gentiles, the colonizer. This is why they literally replace us. When you look to Israel today, you see the colonizer, and he identifies as a Jew. When you look at indigenous tribes today, you see the colonizer, and they identify as Native Americans. Both are actually products of Europeans mixing with us over and over to produce whiter and whiter Yaśarelim, who have less and less Yaśareli blood. These are European Jews and European Indians with very little blood connection to the original people. That was the plan from the beginning. When speaking of our family tree in this same chapter, which is traditionally described as an olive tree, Paul writes in verse 7, quote, If some of the branches be broken off, and thou being a wild olive tree were graft in among them, and with them partake of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be graft in.
Did you hear that? That's what they really think. They believe the branches were broken off to make room for foreign branches to be grafted on.
Our stumble is seen by the European as an opportunity for the Gentile to become the larger part of the body of Yaśarelim. To them, this is salvation from the fate of those who oppress us. The prophecies against our colonizers had already been spoken, and they will bring terrifying events for our oppressors. Jesus provided an ideology based on how they can avoid it all by replacing us. They're still strategizing about how to keep us Christian even today.
The best way to win a Native American is be friends. Just absolutely be friends with them. Let them know you love them and care for them. And once you make friends, you can tell them anything then. Because now you've got their heart, you've got their mind, and they're willing to listen about anything that you have to say, as long as within reason. But when it comes to the gospel, they're interested in knowing about God Himself. So you have to understand that there's a difference between the reservation native and the urban native. The reservation native and the urban native. The reservation native and the urban native. And it's important to know that.